Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. As we continue our discussion of the Revolutionary Era in American history, in the previous lecture we talked about some of the final attempts at maintaining peace between the British and the colonists. And in this lecture we're going to look at some of the early skirmishes and battles in what breaks out into the Revolutionary War, along with a few of the final last-ditch attempts to restore peace between the two sides. Now, one thing that's important to note as we think about some of those early skirmishes in the Revolutionary War is that the colonies had come to depend on local militias for their own public defense and in some ways for a sort of police force maintaining order in the colonies. So all of the colonies had militias already established, but that was about it in terms of any sort of military in the colonies. So for the British, disabling those militias became one of the first goals of these early skirmishes in the Revolutionary War, and they thought that perhaps by removing the weapons and disarming these militias, they might be able to sort of undo whatever ability to wage war that the colonies might have had. In April of 1775, the British dispatched troops to Lexington and Concord to seize the gunpowder and other military supplies that were stored there. Paul Revere, who was an outspoken member of the Sons of Liberty, rode from Boston to Lexington and Concord to spread the alarm. Along with a few other riders who helped, they managed to get the word out before the British arrived. And so when about 700 British soldiers arrived at Lexington, they confronted a small force of 60 or 70 militiamen there. The two sides exchanged fire, the first shots of the Revolutionary War. And the colonial militia held its own before the superior force of British held sway. The British then marched to Concord, where they confronted yet another group of colonial militia, and again the militia stood its ground, and eventually the British forced to retreat, along the way making an easy target for some of the colonial militia who took pot shots at them as they retreated. The British also launched attacks on militia and military supplies in other colonies as well, most notably Virginia's capital of Williamsburg, where British forces seized the gunpowder and destroyed muskets and other supplies that were stored in a military storehouse. At that point, some of Virginia's citizens, led by Patrick Henry, marched on the governor's mansion. The governor was Lord Dunmore. At that point, Lord Dunmore made a stunning announcement that he would declare freedom to slaves and reduce the city of Williamsburg to ashes if the conflict continued. This was known as Lord Dunmore's proclamation, and over the ensuing weeks, he actually followed through on the proclamation to offer freedom to any slave who joined forces with the British in suppressing the colonial rebellion. Within a few months, he was joined by 800 slaves. Many Virginians who were teetering on the fence between joining the Patriots or maintaining their loyalty, because of this proclamation and the idea of freeing the slaves, were compelled to join the Patriot side. So we see even at this stage in the Revolution, the idea of slavery is a very important one in colonial identity, and particularly in the South and in Virginia. The colonies were rapidly being divided into two camps, the Patriots versus the Loyalists. Growing numbers of colonists began to realize that only through rebellion could they expect political and legal freedom. The British system was no longer looking out for their interest. This is at the heart of the Patriot argument. Loyalists held the other side, that only by remaining loyal and staying part of the British Empire could they achieve freedom and the rights that they had had before. So let me just summarize a few more of the views that were held by the Patriots and the Loyalists. So Patriots argued that people have inalienable rights, that the government can't take those rights away. And we're going to see some of those arguments expressed in the Declaration of Independence, which we'll talk about in the next lecture. They also argued what I discussed in the previous lecture, the famous phrase of no taxation without representation. Because they did not have a voice in Parliament, it was unjust that they should be taxed by that body. Many patriots also believed that they had already sacrificed enough by fighting with the British against the French in the French and Indian War. They also argued that it was British personnel who were really stirring up trouble at that time, and I described in the previous lecture how many members of the British Army were indeed sort of low-class troublemakers. And again, to summarize, Patriots believed that only by parting with Britain could they achieve true liberty. The Loyalists, on the other hand, argued that we had always supported the British Empire, we've always been a part of the British Empire, and we should remain a part of the British Empire. They also argued that as British citizens, they were required to abide by British law, even if they didn't support or favor that law. And so they had to go along with the taxes that were being put upon them. They also, in many cases, accepted the argument that those taxes were intended to pay for their own defense in the colonies. There were other arguments as well. Loyalists argued that the colonies can't survive without British support, that they were so closely tied to Britain that they needed to maintain those ties just to survive. They also argued that this trade with Britain allowed them to be profitable. Many of them made their living in some way trading with the British, and also that they simply needed the goods that were provided by the British. And in some cases they argued that being represented in Parliament was not practical. They were across an ocean from Britain, and so it wasn't necessary for them to have representatives in that body. And finally, I think we might sympathize to some extent with the Loyalists who were simply afraid of change. Making the leap that the Patriots called for was a dramatic and in some ways frightening one. Now, this is one of those instances that I talked about at the very beginning of this course, where you and I now understand that the Patriot side is going to be victorious, and in some ways we associate our current nation and the long history that we've had since the Revolutionary War with the ideals of the Patriots. But we need to be careful in this instance that people at that time didn't know that the Patriot side was going to prevail. And in fact, as we're going to discuss shortly, many of the advantages heading into the Revolutionary War appeared to lie with the British side. So we need to kind of clear our minds that we already know the outcome heading into this discussion and realize that at that time there was very much up in the air. This is one of those instances of contingency that I talked about early in this course. At that time the outcome is uncertain, whereas you and I already know how things are going to turn out. 2 months after the battles at Lexington and Concord, the sides clashed again near Boston in 2 more battles at Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill. And Breed's Hill was actually the more significant of the 2 skirmishes. While the British ultimately prevailed in both of these battles, it was difficult going, and the Patriots showed that they could hold their own against the British in these battles. And so this indicated to the British that this was going to be perhaps a longer and harder fought war than they expected going in. Now, I mentioned in the previous lecture that in the aftermath of Lexington and Concord and Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill, the Continental Congress made one last attempt at reconciliation with King George III. In July of 1775, the Continental Congress issued what has come to be called the Olive Branch Petition, again proclaiming that they were loyal to the king rather than to Parliament. George III rejected this attempt at reconciliation, And at that point, an open division between the colonies and Britain was ripped open. Now, I want to point out a painting that was made of the battle at Bunker Hill by an artist named John Trumbull, who was a famous artist of that time. This painting was made about 11 years after the battle took place. And it presents a pretty complicated picture of what was happening in this battle, the death of General Warren at the Battle of Bunker Hill. And General Warren, who was an American general, takes center stage in this battle. Now, it's worth noting and remembering that John Trumbull, as an artist, was hoping to sell copies of this painting, and thus he wanted to make it as kind of dramatic and also as appealing to a wide audience as he could. And so if you notice, in one of the elements of this painting, we see a British major whose name was John Small staying the hand of one of his infantrymen who is trying to thrust a bayonet into the dying Warren. So this is seen as kind of a noble act on the battlefield, and actually helped to make this painting very popular with both supporters of the British side and the American side. It kind of depicts nobility in the face of the battlefield. As one final note, kind of depicting the views of that day, John Trumbull places in an inferior position any African Americans who are shown in this painting. And we estimate that there were about 14 African Americans who took the field in those battles, but they barely appear in this painting, although it is believed by historians that one African American, whose name was Peter Salem, played an important role in the battle and may have fired the shot that killed a British major during the battle, Major Pitcairn. So we see reflected in the painting the views of that day, African Americans marginalized in the painting just as they were in society at that time.